Hi, my name is Kirsten Johnson. I'm Head of Music and Drama at an independent boys prep school. Previously, I've been Head of House and Head of Faculty in a number of London Comprehensives. I'm currently undertaking the Chartered Teacher qualification with the Chartered College of Teaching. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how to use criterion-based assessment effectively in the classroom. So what is criterion-based assessment? Green defines it as one of the aims of criterion referencing is to focus on individual differentiated assessment. By moving away from norm referencing to a system which describes what students know, understand and can do, assessments can be used to provide feedback and to inform future teaching and learning needs. So criterion-based assessment then is the use of outcome descriptors to assess attainment. The difference between criterion-based assessment and norm-referenced assessment is that no matter how well you do in norm-referenced assessment, no matter your score, you are not guaranteed to get a specific grade because you are ranked against everyone else who has also sat that assessment. That is why we have the grading curves at GCSE and A-level, and why, although we have grade boundaries, they do change a little bit from year to year. You can never quite be sure what grade a student is going to get. With criterion-based referencing, then the student is marked against specific criteria and it's very clear what they have to do in order to get a certain grade or what they have not done, which has stopped them from getting that specific grade. So the current GCSE and A-level exams are norm referenced, meaning the students are ranked against each other. The old national curriculum levels are an example of criterion-based assessment, where each subject at each level has an outcome-based attainment descriptor. The slightly newer 2014 national curriculum subject content and the GCSE, BTEC, A-level specifications often provide quite a good starting point for developing your own criterion-based assessment criteria. So what are some of the benefits of using criterion-based assessment and what are some of the criticisms of it? Here's an example of the subject content from the national curriculum. This is music at Key Stage 1. We've got 4 bullet points for the entire Key Stage. It can be quite vague. This tells us what we as teachers need to cover by the end of year 2. So although criterion-based assessment can provide quite clear guidelines for planning your sequence of learning, shows progression between levels of attainment and delineates between the different content that's covered, it can be quite vague. So it is useful for a busy exam syllabus to ensure you're using it as a guide for your curriculum. You know that you're covering everything and you know that you're assessing everything that needs to be assessed, all the skills, all the knowledge that the students need. Sometimes it can be a little bit vague to begin with. It can also be a little bit subjective as well. The issue with such subject content statements, as you can see here, is that they are not themselves assessment criteria. They are far too broad. They, in some cases, are entirely subjective. So one teacher's definition of playing an untuned instrument musically might be quite different from another's. And it also invites the question, do we grade on a curve here? Are we saying that musically for a year 1 student is different to musically for a year 2 student? They're both within Key Stage 1. And so are we not expecting the same thing from both students? Because the start of year 1 to the end of year 2 is quite a gap. But this doesn't give you that information, and this is where you have to use the broad criteria that you're given and your professional judgment to make it usable for you as formative assessment. It's also worth remembering then, when we talk about the difference between the start of year 1 to the end of year 2, that the original national curriculum levels were designed to be summative assessment at the end of each key stage, the same with GCSE and the same with the A-level specifications as well. This is discussed quite widely by Daisy Christodoulo in her book, Making Good Progress. So she says criterion-based assessment systems cannot provide accurate or formative data as they use language which is descriptive rather than analytical. So this is where we go back to musically. That is a descriptor. It's not something that really that you can define well enough to use for accurate data. But I would agree with her. I would agree that this criteria is too wide to be useful as formative assessment. But I would also argue that formative assessment doesn't exist to provide data. Summative assessment is to provide data. Formative assessment is to provide feedback and to move a student forward. So at the very most, you may, through your formative assessments, be provided with some form of data, but all that it tells you is where that student was before you provided that formative comment to them. And so it needs to be done quite regularly. Like all good formative assessment, it needs to happen regularly. It needs to be part of the lesson. The student needs to expect that. They need to know how to work on and reflect and build on the formative discussions and the comments that you give them. And if you wish to record the data from these conversations, or these observations, if you will, then that's absolutely fine. But it's not the focus of a formative assessment or a formative conversation. So it's important to ensure that whilst you are using this slightly more generic criteria, so in our example, the National Curriculum for Key Stage 1 Music, to inform what you're planning and what you're delivering to your students, that in itself cannot be used as assessment criteria without first undergoing a little bit of metamorphosis. You need to use this generic information. You need to sort of distill it down and decide, well, actually, what is it that I need to see as a teacher so that I'm confident that the student has covered all of that, that they have grasped that, and that they're able to show me that they can play tuned and untuned instruments musically. So when you distill that down, say, what does that look like in my classroom? And then that gives you an idea of what you're going to do as an assessment task. What are you teaching, and then what are you assessing? If you take this sort of specific assessment criteria then for that task and you give it a scoring system, it becomes a task-specific rubric. Now, effective criterion-based assessments, or rubrics as we'll call them now, require three features. They need to have evaluative criteria, they need to have quality definitions for those criteria at each particular level, and they need to have a scoring strategy. So that's Popham in 1997 said that, and he's followed it up with some more work on what's right and what's wrong with rubrics. Johnson and Svingby in 2007 suggested that there's actually four types of rubric: analytical, holistic, generic and task-specific. Furthermore, according to Reedy and Andrade in 2010, you can further categorise these by those which are teacher-created and those which are co-created with students. I personally have only focused on the teacher-created rubrics, and I think that's probably what most busy teachers would be doing, because they are the ones that are driving that curriculum, saying this is what I'm teaching, this is when I'm teaching it, this is why I'm teaching it, this is what I expect the students to be able to do, this is the task that's going to show me that they can do this, and therefore this is the mark stream, the rubric that I'm going to apply to that specific task. To start to build a co-created with students rubric into that, perhaps relinquishes a bit of control over the assessment process that I'm not sure would be particularly helpful in my classroom, but everyone does approach their teaching slightly differently. Along with the co-created and the teacher-created, we have those four main categories. Holistic, meaning that the teacher is observing, they're taking everything into account, they're looking all of the work, and then they are arriving at one grade, which is recorded. What I prefer to use is an analytical rubric, where all aspects are marked individually and then they're combined or averaged to reach that one final grade. That's how the GCSE and A level works. If you take music GCSE or drama GCSE, for instance, in music you have your listening paper, you have your performance exam, which is marked, and you've got your coursework, which in case of music is composition. They are marked. those 4 marks go together to create your mark out of 200. That raw mark out of 200 is what gets applied to the grading grids, and you come out with your 1 or your 9. The same with drama. You have your written exam, you have your performance exam for the examiner, and you also have your devising work. And within your devising work, you have got the performance, which is videoed, and you also have the logbook of all the devising process. Again, those 4 things are all marked, the marks go together, and so we're looking at an analytical rubric for most GCSE A-level subjects. Generic rubrics are not useful for formative assessment. They may be useful in some cases for summative assessment. You will find a generic rubric in most exam specifications. It tells you what needs to be taught. Task-specific rubrics are very useful to us. Again, you will find these in exam specifications. You will find them in music or drama. For instance, you are told, what does a band 1 performance look like? What does the band 2 performance look like? And you're able to use that information to grade the students that are in front of you. The Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music have just launched a new videoed performance grades during the last month or so, and they have released a specification for that as it is regulated by Ofqual. And again, that is a task-specific rubric which is in there. It tells you what you need to do in order to attain pass merit distinction at whichever grade level you are sitting. So in my classroom, I really favour analytical task-specific rubrics for assessing my students. So Johnson and Swingby also say that their conclusions, they made 3 conclusions, 2 of which are quite relevant to this discussion. They said that reliable scoring of performance assessments can be enhanced by the use of rubrics, especially if they're analytical, topic specific, and complemented with exemplars or other training. So we as teachers, if we're modelling what we expect our students to show us alongside these rubrics, and that's going to make it much more useful to the students and to us. They've also found that rubrics seem to have the potential of promoting learning or improving instruction. The main reason being that rubrics make the expectations and the criteria explicit, so that allows the students to engage in self-assessment and to have more appropriate feedback conversations with the teacher. I'm really interested in this idea that it improves instruction as well, and to me, I think that comes as part of being a reflective practitioner. And if you're looking at an assessment and a child is not doing well in that assessment, and you think, well, actually, did I not teach that bit clearly enough? Or maybe I didn't spend enough time on that, or maybe I just forgot to teach that bit altogether, because everyone seems to be struggling with that. It really allows the teacher to be quite reflective in the moment as well, and for the teacher to step back and think, well, what am I going to do to help that student improve? What is it that I am going to change in order to be useful to that student's progression? So I'm going to use here an example of my Year 3 Glockenspiel unit and how the journey from the national curriculum content through to what I show the boys in their lesson. I move my head a bit. I don't know where I'm going to go. Up here. So these 4 bullet points are the Key Stage 2 bullet points. So I've highlighted in yellow the things that this unit targets specifically. So in this case, performance, improvisation, composition, and using staff notation. So that's our generic text. We also then translate that into more specific, unit-specific detail. So what does improvising and composing look like? Well, for Year 3 in this unit, I'm going to ask them to compose 3-note patterns. Later on in the year, I ask them to compose 5-note patterns. For instance, we're going to ask them to lead a group in a performance. So they're going to be performing in an ensemble context, but they're going to be leading the group. maybe performing as a soloist when they play their composition. Use and understand staff notation. Well, this is year 3 groups who are working on pre-grade 1 music theory, and so for them to be using and understanding that staff notation, part of that comes into the performance, and part of that is in those theory booklets where we're looking at lines, spaces, note values, that sort of thing, that really are the building blocks of what they need to do in order to be successful. So you can see that I've got then my task specific criteria. I have said that to be successful at step 3, exceeding, I have said that I want them to compose a successful jazz melody using swing rhythms and a developed melody. For them to be successful at step 2, when it's expected outcomes, to use my school's vocabulary, then perhaps that melody has straight rhythms and lots of repetition. So they've got the idea, it's not incorrect, but it's missing some of those stylistic features that you would expect of swing music, jazz music. Hence, it is only a step 2 and not a step 3. Step 1, as you can see, is missing that composition entirely. So they spent all their time managing to perform the pieces that they have been given, but they haven't managed to put together their own piece of music yet. And so that would be emerging, that would be below what we would expect of our year 3 students to be able to do. So how do we then use this? Well, implementing rubrics successfully, to me, I would say that they are best done at curriculum planning level when you're deciding what you're teaching. So you're taking that national curriculum generic text when you're deciding what you're going to teach, and then you distill that down into, I think I've got 51 out of those 4 bullet points, descriptions really of what you expect to see. You want to see that they can compose 3-note patterns, they can lead a group in a performance, and so on and so on. And then we take that unit specific detail and I decide what that looks like in each unit. Composing 3-note patterns in this glockenspiel unit looks different to how it might look in the recorder unit, simply because the pieces of music that they've been studying as part of this glockenspiel unit are mostly jazzy, and so we've asked them to compose in that style, so it's something familiar to them. And we want to see specific then jazz features such as swing rhythms. If we were looking at a different style of music, then that 3-note pattern composition task would look different, and therefore the assessment criteria would look slightly different in each unit. So it's about making sure that we've got that generic text so that we know what we're teaching, no matter what specification, what course it is. We then have that more specific detail that we've distilled down, and then you've got that task specific criteria. So that same unit detail can be applied differently to different tasks. There's no point in just creating an assessment criteria and without taking into account what you've actually taught. If you haven't taught it properly, then your task specific, your assessment criteria is useless. All that it tells you is that your students haven't achieved well in that unit because they haven't been taught what they needed to be taught. The data is useless to you then. So I did some basic investigation at a previous school, and the students said that they preferred to have the assessment criteria shared with them right from the start of the unit. So in a 12-lesson unit, I used to introduce it around lesson 4. Once the students were comfortable with what they were doing, be it a new instrument or a new period of music that they were looking at, so they got into grips with what they were doing, and then they were starting to work specifically towards that assessment criteria. The students, when we surveyed it with different classes, said that they preferred to have that assessment right from the get-go, and so I don't use learning outcomes or objectives anymore. I simply say these are the national curriculum strands that we're targeting in the unit, and this is the assessment criteria, this is what you're being assessed on at the end, and the students use that as their outcomes for the unit. But one of the things that I think's maybe worth investigating further, I'm a practical subject teacher. I teach music and drama. Are these rubrics more helpful though to practical subject teachers than they are to perhaps more academic subjects? On a personal level, I use them more effectively for the practical side of my subject than I do for the analytical and theory side of my subject. It's perhaps because I'm just more comfortable with that side of the teaching, or it might be because on the listening side, on the theory side, there's just so much variation from task to task, from week to week, that it becomes very difficult to pin it down. The theory tends to be lots of one-off small exercises, whereas the practical is a much longer project. I suppose they start and they have to learn the piece of music and they have to put it together as a performance, and so it takes much longer to do. So with my certainly with the practical aspect, as you can see, it's much more specific. With the listening down here, the theory exercises, I'm using these sorts of percentage bands. That does mean then that I have to use my mid-unit marking much more effectively. So I do have to deep mark those listening exercises, and I do have to have those formative conversations or leave formative comments to the students, because that missing 20% in the percentage scoring bands, it doesn't tell you what it is that they struggled with. You don't know just from looking at that number what it is they can or can't do. Is it lines and spaces? Is it rhythms? Is it time signatures? And so that's where that marking comes in. You can see here that Popham says that, you know, the third thing that's really important for a successful rubric is a scoring strategy. So I've given each of these a number. My conversion from Google Slides hasn't gone well here. As you can see, I've just got 1, 2 and 3. Very simple. And then when I record it for my data drop purposes, then I have just ragged it 1, 2 and 3 against the criteria. I've organised my criteria into strands just to make it easier for my own planning purposes, to make sure I know what I'm covering, but that is just a personal preference. So when I'm logging data, I tend to log formatively, lesson to lesson, using an app on my iPad, iDocio, and I can have that same scoring rubric there for every single lesson. So I've got 12 lessons, I could have 12 copies of this scoring rubric, just with the dates on it, and I can just tap it every week, and then you should hopefully see the student improve through the weeks. So they should all start off at 1 and then they improve through the weeks. I wouldn't keep that data necessarily for my summative purposes, but I would take the final one and transfer it onto a spreadsheet like this for my summative purposes. But formatively, it's really helpful to be able to take a video of the student and just straight there in the app and be able to give them a grade then and then. It means that you can come back to that performance in a couple of weeks' time as well, as well, actually, this is what you did before, this is the grade we had then, can you see how it's improved from there? So I just use this basic 1, 2, 3 red, amber, green idea. The numbers are helpful because it means that, you know, with your scoring strategy, you can decide how you're going to use that data later on. So it might be that you want to average it out across all the composing strands and give them a composing grade or a unit grade. So you could average these 3 to give a unit, or as I said, you can do the different strands, however you see fit and however it's going to be useful to you as a teacher. If you are using it for GCSE A-level, you might want to have slightly more nuanced grades than this, but I would caution the idea of splitting the grades too much, and then you end up with the madness that we had with the national curriculum levels of the difference between a 5A and a 6C being absolutely minuscule and meaningless. But if it is going to be helpful for you to break it down further, then by all means create your own scoring system that is meaningful to you, but don't overcomplicate it, because then it dilutes it and it becomes not quite so useful. So, as I said, I am a fan of using these rubrics as formative assessment. They are also quite helpful for summative assessment at the end, but it's actually a byproduct of them being used formatively. It's not about the grade really. The grade, that number 1, 2 or 3, just helps you to record it on your spreadsheet. It is about the comment. It is, why is it a 1? Why is it a 2? Why is it not yet a 3? If the curriculum isn't well sequenced, then the assessment criteria will be vague and the assessment task will not be appropriate, and then it is pointless. So you really need to make sure, as the curriculum leader or whoever, whatever your role is in organising the teaching and learning and the assessment, you need to be careful that the overall curriculum is well planned and sequenced, it has robust assessment tasks, they are carefully planned, and the criteria is carefully linked to the actual task itself. Rosenshine and Stevens have said way back in 1986, they cautioned that if the underlying curriculum is flawed, then any research-based pedagogies that you apply to that curriculum are not going to be as successful as they might otherwise be. And to leave you with a little bit of advice from Torrance, he warns of the journey from assessment of learning through assessment for learning to assessment as learning. This is not learning. This is not your scheme of work. This is simply your assessment criteria for one unit, for one specific task. It is not a scheme of work. Do not become focused on teaching to the test. Teach the content that your students need to know to be successful in your subject. But just be very, very clear on what you're assessing, when you're assessing, how you're assessing, and why you are assessing it. I use this here to inform my planning, make sure that I've covered everything. As you can see, I've broken it down into my strands here as well, but it is not, this is not the assessment grid. This is just the planning and tracking. There we go. So some further reading for you if you are interested. I hope you managed to reflect on what you currently do in terms of assessment, and that if you are looking to implement criterion-based assessment, that this has been useful for you and that you go on to implement it effectively in your classroom.